Welcome to another episode of Breaking the Silence podcast. I am your host, Lynette Anderson. We are here today talking about all things grief. Did you know that grief does not only happen when you lose a loved one, but grief comes from when you have to let go of things that you once held close to your heart. In this episode, I want to really talk about all things grief, the things that we grieve on a daily basis that we don't even realize we are grieving from. Some things we grieve can be life transitions, right? So we grieve old identities, we grieve the loss of careers, we grieve the loss of relationships. So I want to talk to you today about all things grief. I want to help you identify the difference between grief and mourning, because sometimes we can be grieving and we don't allow ourselves to properly mourn the grieving process. That's why we stay stuck in cycles and holding patterns, and sometimes that grief weighs us down. So today I want to help you understand the difference of grief and mourning. They both show up in our lives, and how God can use both to bring comfort and restoration. Did you know that grief and mourning are not the same thing? Grief is what we feel. Mourning is how we express it. One happens on the inside and the other happens on the outside. Mourning brings healing. Grief is an internal experience and pain, like sadness, confusion, anger after you feel the loss. An example would be a feeling of a deep ache in your heart when you think about what or who you lost. Mourning is an external expression of that grief, how you show and how you process grief outwardly. An example of that would be crying, praying, writing in a journal, talking to others about the grief of what you lost. Grief is a feeling, the inner emotional response to a loss. Mourning is the expression, how we let the pain out and begin to heal. You can't heal what you don't allow yourself to feel, and we can't release what we refuse to acknowledge. Here's a backstory of my story. For years, doing hair was my passion. I found my identity in doing hair. And it wasn't until recently that I discovered that I was grieving doing hair. Now, you can feel when God is shifting you. You can feel when a transition is happening in your life. But what you do in that transition process, if you're going to stay in that grief or if you're going to allow God to process you through the grief of that transition. And here's what happened. Sometimes we get stuck in transition. That's what I'm here to help you with today. In my journey of doing hair full time as an entrepreneur over the past 5 years, I gave God a yes. I left my full-time job and gave God a yes to do hair full time. During that journey, I encountered a lot of women, special women that I hold dear to my heart. We had so many good conversations, laughter, joy, crying together, praying together. But what I realized was God used me doing hair to bring that purpose out in me. The purpose that was always in me, but it was dormant because I wasn't exercising the gift that He gave me. Now, during the process of me doing hair, there was a transition happening that I didn't know that I was grieving. God told me to go home and close the doors. During that season, I was confused, I was lost, I was angry, and it was hard for me to fully accept that God was closing the door. I didn't realize that God was closing that door until recently, where I really began to mourn. I no longer held those feelings in of the grief that I was feeling inside. I allowed myself to cry about what was lost or what I felt that I lost. I allowed myself to cry about me letting go of what I thought my life should look like. Yes, I was disappointed. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I was confused. But here's the key thing. Mourning is the bridge that brings healing. So I discovered that I was grieving, but I wasn't allowing myself to mourn. Once I allowed myself to mourn, that's when healing began to happen. You may be just like me. God may be telling you to release some things so that you can step into the next thing that He has for you. So my question to you today is, what is God asking you to release? Because we can't move forward with the new until we release the old. We can't fully embrace the new thing that God is doing until we release the old. There's a story in the Bible in 1 Samuel when God asked Samuel, how much longer are you going to mourn over Saul? God asked me that when I realized I was going through a transition and I stayed in this place far longer than God wanted me to stay in. God asked Samuel, how much longer are you going to mourn over Saul? And what I realized was that God was concerned about Samuel. Even in that moment, God was concerned about Samuel. He saw Samuel grieving the loss of Saul, what he thought Saul should have became, and also his death. And it wasn't until Samuel cried out, until Samuel had the funeral for Saul, that he allowed himself to mourn so that he can be healed. Now, I was just like, God, you are so good. You think about us even when we don't even think about ourselves. In that moment, God cared about Samuel. He knew the path that was ahead of him. He knew that he was going to be able to anoint David later down the line to become king. But Samuel didn't know what was ahead of him because he was holding on to the past. He hadn't fully released himself to let go of Saul. That's something to think about. So what are you holding on to that God is telling you to let go of so that you can fully embrace what God has coming for you? Now, that is something to think about. In my journey, I know that me doing hair is going to soon come to an end. Yes, I'm still doing hair, but I'm no longer grieving. I'm allowing God to process me through the mourning of what I thought I lost, because there is no loss in God, right? It's only gains. Gains. I gained my peace. I gained my identity. I gained freedom. I gained healing. I gained all the things that I thought that I lost was really a gain. Many people get stuck in the transition, the in between of who they were and who they are becoming. They don't realize that what they're actually feeling is grief. Grief shows up when God calls us to release people, places, things, old identities that no longer fit where He is taking us. We think we're just struggling to move on, but really our hearts are grieving what was familiar. You can't heal from what you won't name. And sometimes naming the grief is the first step to healing. Many people get stuck in transition because they don't recognize that they are grieving. Grief isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about the loss of what's familiar. And I get it because I've been there. There was a season in my life that I didn't realize that I was grieving either. I thought I was just struggling to move on, to let go. But I was really holding on to a season that God had already closed. And for me, that season was me doing hair. It wasn't just a career to me. It's where my ministry was birthed. It was my identity was tied to that career, but now I discover my identity is in God. And when God started shifting me away from it, I didn't want to let it go. I didn't recognize it as grief back then, but that's exactly what it was. Sometimes God would allow grief to move us into purpose. Mourning isn't a weakness, it's obedience. This hurts, but God I trust you. In Psalms 34:8, it says, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and those who are crushed in spirit. God opens the door. I want you to think about this today. What is something that you are grieving, that you haven't given yourself permission to mourn? Talk to God about it. Write it down. Let yourself release it. Healing starts with honesty. This podcast is to help you identify the areas in your life that you may be grieving, that you don't quite understand that it's grief. I hope this episode helped you to identify the areas in your life that you may be grieving, that you haven't allowed yourself to mourn, because mourning is the bridge to healing. Thank you all for joining Breaking the Silence podcast. I have a couple of things that's coming up. I want to help walk you through the stages of grief so that you can identify what stage of grief you are in. And not only that, I'm going to give you the resources on how do you fully accept what God is asking you to release. I am going to walk you through getting to the acceptance part of grief so that you can surrender to God's perfect will for your life. That's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks. So be sure to keep an eye out on that so that you won't miss any updates on that. That's going to be coming up within the next month. I'm going to be having a grief support group. It's going to be called All Things Grief. I'm coming for the ones that's grieving, that don't even recognize that it's grief, that's sitting stuck in cycles and holding patterns, and you don't realize that it's grief that you are dealing with. I'm coming to help you get unstuck. So until next time, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Breaking the Silence podcast.